Alzheimer's disease is a public health crisis that is rapidly expanding as our nation ages. An estimated 500,000 Americans die each year from causes related to Alzheimer's. Think about that. Many more Americans will die this year from Alzheimer's-related causes than from COVID-19. It is the only top 10 cause of death, currently without an effective treatment or a cure. Is it any wonder that Alzheimer's remains the most feared chronic disease by U.S. retirees, even during the most dangerous global pandemic of an infectious disease in more than a century? Alzheimer's takes a devastating emotional and financial toll on people living with the disease, their caregivers and families, and our nation. It is inescapable that chronic aging-related diseases such as dementia will be the next emerging pandemic. Dementia threatens to be larger, longer, more devastating, and more costly than COVID-19. The Economist described rising levels of dementia as a global emergency. Alzheimer's disease is a worldwide demographic and societal problem, and the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, created by CEOI and the World Economic Forum, is developing a global action plan. It will build a diverse global cohort for finding new treatments, a clinical trials platform to speed treatments to patients, and prepare the healthcare system for improved care. The United States created a moonshot equivalent effort when it set a national goal to effectively treat and prevent Alzheimer's by 2025, with a plan to get there and with the government structures and mechanisms to deliver it. After some earlier disappointments, there are new and hopeful signs of progress. We could be at the turning point in the fight against this disease. At least 3 drugs could be available in 2021. These include the first disease-modifying treatment for early Alzheimer's, a new treatment for hallucinations and delusions, and a drug therapy for insomnia symptoms associated with Alzheimer's and dementia. We've also seen progress in the development of tests to help detect and diagnose the disease and biomarkers that will help make future treatment decisions. These tools are as critical to success as new treatments. But despite these positive signs, more must be done to clear the path for approval, use, and coverage of new tests and treatments. How robust is the drug pipeline? How can we ensure that healthcare providers have the right tests and treatment available for the right patients at the right time and know how to use them? Will Medicare cover the costs of these necessary diagnostic tests and treatments? How can we stop this emerging global pandemic? Will the U.S. meet our national goal of preventing and effectively treating Alzheimer's disease by 2025?
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. It's my true pleasure to actually host that conversation today, and I think the topic is of immense relevance in the period we are in. My name is Arnaud Bernard. I'm the head of the Health and Healthcare Practice at the World Economic Forum. And you may wonder why you find the World Economic Forum in a discussion on Alzheimer, such an important topic, and why with Us Against Alzheimer. So let me tell you a little bit of that background. We got to meet with George Vradenburg in the months preceding last annual meeting in Davos, and we know, we started to discuss with George, is there anything that we can do where the forum could actually replicate some of the successes of the past in a field of such significance? And the forum is a platform for making coalitions happen and public-private partnership happen. And that's where 20 years ago, the forum was launching the Global Alliance for Vaccination and Immunization, Gavi, an organization that ever since has raised $19 billion, vaccinated 700 million children, and averted the death of arguably more than 10 million children. And in 2017, after 1 year of hard work and really a robust business model development and all sorts of activities around the right pathogens to target, the right investment strategies, the right science, we were able to launch the Coalition for Epidemics Preparedness Innovations. And that instrument has been very relevant in the fight against COVID, as they have incubated no less than 10 vaccines. And partnering with Gavi, actually, they're also managing the Advanced Purchase Commitment Facility to benefit low and middle income countries. So with George, we felt that Alzheimer was a space where there is to some degree the same issue of misalignment of incentives. But there are also progresses that can be made when it comes to science. And we started to work together. And I need to say that I'm very impressed with everything that has been delivered since January, because the Davos Alzheimer Collaborative, that initiative we are planning to launch early next year, really all the promises of being, after Gavi and CEPI, maybe a third very defining moment in the history of the forum. So with that said, I also want to reflect on short-term goals, because now I'm talking Gavi, it's 20 years ago, but there are goals that have been set by the USA and other governments about actually curbing the curve on Alzheimer by 2025. And that's something that we want to discuss today with eminent panelists and a representation, a very diverse representation from large organizations to smaller ones, from treatments to diagnostics. So I think we have an opportunity to have a great dialogue today. And I would like my remarkably relevant panelists to introduce themselves first, and then we'll go into the meat of the discussion about, is this really possible to turn or to bend the curve by 2025? I would like to start with you, PONNI. PONNI, you are an MD, Senior Vice President, Global Head of Medical Affairs at Acadia Pharmaceuticals. Tell us a little bit what got you to that position and what Acadia is doing in the space.
Sure. So I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Acadia, and I actually started in industry about 20 years ago. I'm a neurologist by training, and I used to take care of Alzheimer's patients. I actually came to the pharmaceutical sector because I was actually quite frustrated with the options that were available to treat patients who are affected by this devastating disease. So I really feel an honor to be part of this important dialogue. So in Acadia, Acadia is actually a neuroscience company. It has been working on research in this area to meet unmet needs for the past 25 years. And the reason this is important is because there's a lot of unmet needs in Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. But one area that's really important, that's getting more recognition now, is in addition to the cognitive symptoms, the neurobehavioral symptoms are really, really important that they be recognized and treated. So we are very focused on developing solutions to address that unmet need.
Thank you very, very much. That's remarkably interesting, and we'll go deeper into those opportunities as we move forward. And maybe over to you, Shirfi. I mean, there has been a lot of Biogen in the news and recently, and in your role of head of commercial at Biogen, you are possibly going to get to a point where there will be a considerable paradigm shift. But before we go into that discussion, tell us a little bit about yourself and what Biogen is doing.
Thank you, Arno. Shirfi Guindo is my name. I'm responsible for global product strategy and commercialization at Biogen. I have been in industry almost 30 years now at this point. And it's been really a blessing and a privilege for me to be at Biogen at this point in time, having been in having been part of other really major public health fights, if you want, you know, from HIV years ago to vaccines. You mentioned vaccines and Gavi. I was at Merck during the time when Merck played a key role in that process. More recently, hepatitis C, which is now a curable disease, and immuno-oncology. So I was part of all of those fights. And so I joined Biogen about 3 years ago now, with the opportunity really to be part of this next horizon of change in biomedical science and medicine, really, because patients in neuroscience have been, in neurology have been waiting for so long. And so we are hopeful. I look forward to the conversation today. It's a really important meeting. And so let me stop here and then hand it back to you, Arno.
Thank you very much, Yirfi, and we hope the world can enjoy the same type of success on Alzheimer as we have seen in hepatitis. So thank you very much. And I have to reflect on J&J because J&J was if there is one company that knows about CEPI and the launch of this vaccine alliance, certainly J&J, Johnson & Johnson, and the great leadership of Paul Stoffel. And HUSSEINI, you've been working with the forum for many years, global councils, all sorts of initiatives, you name them, and you are head of global brain health at J&J. So tell us what did bring you to that space, and what J&J is doing in the field.
Great, thank you, Arno. It's really a pleasure to be with you today, and really want to thank the World Economic Forum for taking such a leadership position in this great, societal unmet need. I'm HUSSEINI MANJI. I was trained as an MD with clinical training in neurology and psychiatry, and additional training in molecular and cellular biology, and spent the first half of my career at the US National Institutes of Health, trying to really understand some of these diseases and come up with treatments. And then, like many of my other illustrious colleagues, made the decision that to really impact human health, if you can come up with treatment and cures, that you can have an even bigger impact. So I was pleased to join J&J about 11 years ago and headed up our neuroscience therapeutic area, where we focus on the major neurodegenerative diseases, and certainly dementia, Parkinson's, MS, and the major psychiatric diseases. And I think, as really echoing all the words you said, Arno, I think it's actually a very exciting time in some ways, but also a very challenging time. So at J&J, we're really committed to doing our own work, and that includes, therapeutics, small and large molecule vaccines, gene therapies, but also diagnostics and digital approaches. But I think we also realize that this is a shared societal responsibility, where we need to do so much more work together, both in terms of advancing the science, but also raising awareness, reduce stigma. And so in that context, it's really been a pleasure to be part of the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, as well as some of the other initiatives we're undertaking with the World Economic Forum, including those to reduce stigma. So thank you for having me on.
Thank you very much, HUSSEINI. You're very generous with your comments on the forum. And I would like to turn over to you, Joel Braunstein. When there will be a cure, and maybe before there will be a treatment, we will need to find those patients. And I was very intrigued when I was reading my notes to know that there is also innovation on diagnostics, because ignorant as I am, for me, Alzheimer is not a disease you can diagnose at this point in time, which may be a problem, by the way, when it comes to bringing to market solutions like the one Biogen will bring to market under the leadership of Shirfi. So Joel, tell us about what you're doing as the CEO of C2N Diagnostics.
Wonderful.
And what brought you there?
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Arno. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's really an honor to be part of this panel and to support the work of US Against Alzheimer's. Maybe just a little bit of professional background. I'm a cardiologist by medical training, and I also spent a good part of my academic career as a Robert Wood Johnson clinical scholar, where I was also involved in doing technology assessment, and technology assessment in the way that we ask questions about how do we optimize clinical outcomes for patients using the appropriate technologies and services. And so it's really trying to allocate the finances that go into healthcare with the most deserved approaches and strategies. And a lot of my interest stemmed in the field of looking at how do we standardize clinical outcomes? And one of the ways in which you standardize clinical outcomes is to reduce variability of care. And so if we can start reducing variation and come up with best practices and guidelines around the best methods for treatment diagnosis, obviously, you know, very important topic for Alzheimer's disease. And coming from the field of cardiovascular medicine, I feel like we're able to maybe take some of these lessons and apply them to Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative disorders. So I helped start C2N Diagnostics with another colleague, Ilana Fogelman, and then two scientific colleagues from the Washington University School of Medicine who are very well known in the field, and they've been wonderful collaborators over the years, Dr. Randy Bateman and Dr. David Holtzman. Both of them have really spearheaded a lot of innovative efforts around helping to better understand the disease, think about novel approaches to therapy, and then even more recently, how do we optimize diagnosis so that we can, again, if we have effective therapies, it's not really a question of if, it's a question of when, we'll be able to identify those individuals who are most likely to benefit and be able to track those changes over time. So at C2N Diagnostics, we're a small biotech company who it has a phenomenal team of scientists and business professionals, and we're working on a variety of diagnostics. Those diagnostics are leveraged in the collaboration with many academic centers to help test new ideas, and also with pharmaceutical companies to help speed and reduce the inefficiencies of clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease. And most importantly, you know, the end game is to think about how can we actually bring these technologies to the clinic, whereby we can now start using them in clinical practice, again, with the hope that we can identify individuals earlier, more precisely, and then ultimately treat them more effectively.
Thank you very, very much, Joel. And thanks to all of you. I think this round of introduction sets the scene also in view of attendees thinking of polishing the questions. I will get there, I promise. We will open the dialogue after we go through those round of questions from my end. And I would like to turn over to you, HUSSEINI, because, you know, turning the course of the disease or stopping, I don't even know what the word was that has been used, by 2025. It sounds to me like unrealistic, unreasonable, but maybe there is acceleration in the speed of research also, and maybe we should be optimistic. So what do you think about 2025 and about optimism?
Great, thank you, Arno. So I do think that my overall message is one of optimism and hope. You know, I think the audience tuning in today really needs to recognize that we are making a lot of progress, and there's reasons to be optimistic that we will get there. I do think that it's quite possible that the timing, you know, like many other diseases, sometimes you make progress, then you have setbacks, and you make progress, etc. And I think that's probably going to be what we see in dementia. So I think we just have to acknowledge that there's still so much to uncover about brain disorders due to the, you know, the rich complexities of the brain. But as I said, we are making tremendous progress in many areas, and maybe I can just highlight a few. I think the main challenge is finding the right target. So when you're trying to treat any condition, you need to understand the biology. And then once you've understood the biology, you need to understand where can we target with some kinds of interventions. And, you know, if you're not targeting the right biology, you know, nothing's going to matter. But I think most of us feel very optimistic that we've actually learned a lot about the disease biology, and we do have many ways to target the underlying disease biology. One of the best examples you've probably heard of is something called tau, where there's a lot of data from, preclinical studies to suggest that it clearly is involved in pathology. But I think you've heard the joke that we've cured a lot of mice, what about humans? And that's where tau is also very relevant, because even in human studies, we've seen that you can sort of track the tau spread in the brain, and the tau spread in the human brain really seems to correlate with clinical features, and that the beginning of tau pathology, as we can measure with biomarkers that you've heard about, some of my colleagues, actually seems to occur at about the same time as the symptoms. So in addition to what you'll hear from, our colleague from Biogen about amyloid, which many people also think is very relevant, tau is a really relevant target. But I think one of the reasons to be most optimistic in recent years is that there's been much more of a diversification of targets. So for many years, we were focused almost exclusively on amyloid and tau. Now we're looking at many other targets, including inflammation, synaptic integrity, neuronal protection, vascular components, and others, all of which we think are very relevant. I do think for this field, and I think it was, fortuitous that you even highlighted hepatitis C. I think that's one of the questions we're still grappling with. Will a single target work, or like many other diseases, will we need a combination strategy? And many of us think that hopefully if the Biogen drug is, successful to begin with, then we could add to it. Just mention a couple more things, and I think this panel is going to illustrate it much more. In addition to having the right targets, you also need predictive biomarkers and sensitive endpoints, because one of the things that's kept this field back is, in contrast to something like oncology or immunology, you've had to have the years-long trials where you're looking at cognitive decline as an endpoint. And if you can have the right biomarkers that give you early readouts, that'll really accelerate our progress. And I really do think that with the advances in blood, CSF, and brain imaging biomarkers, we're there from an experimental standpoint. And I think once we have treatments, even in the real world, we'll be able to do things. And I think, as you know, from the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, I do think that a lot of it's going to actually rely on digital technology. So the last thing I'd like to say, and then, turn it back over to you, is I think one of the reasons I'm also optimistic is because of the advances, not only in the science, but the culture of science. And there again, coming back to some of the examples you made, like the field of HIV/AIDS, when society came together, many companies, governments, academias, all working together. We're seeing that happening in Alzheimer's disease. I think even recently, the COVID-19 example, where people were willing to come together, I think we're seeing that in Alzheimer's disease, and that sort of culture of science is also going to accelerate progress. So I remain very optimistic.
Yeah, but that's very good. And you mentioned also, HUSSEINI, something that is very interesting is about finding new biomarkers and finding biomarkers that could be also predictive of the disease. And to you, Joel, is this also a field of interest for you, or because at this point in time the diagnostics technologies are either relatively crude, thinking about CSF, which has its own challenge in terms of adoption, or very expensive when I think a bit about scans and SPECT CT. So where do you think there will be a game changer in diagnostics, and will this also apply to predictive screening? What do you think the issues are with detections and diagnosis today, and what in your views, if you are also optimistic, shall we see in the future?
Great, thank you. Obviously a very relevant question. It's something our team thinks about on a daily basis. And in fact, we've been around since late 2007, and for about 12 years have been working on biomarkers among a variety of related technologies to really try to better understand this disease and ultimately be able to bring tests to the clinic that can help in diagnosis, early detection, differential diagnosis, so that how can you distinguish one disease from another. So we think it's really essential. And in fact, think it's part and parcel to effective disease therapies, modifying therapies. And, part of the reason for that is obviously we have good clinical scales to look at cognition, but unfortunately, as we know, using those scales, by time someone starts to manifest cognitive symptoms of the disease, we're actually fairly advanced. And so I come back to the field of cardiovascular medicine and think about where some of the major transformative technologies came from, and the ability to reliably measure certain markers. In this case, as an example, take cholesterol. That spearheaded really the foundation for a whole new field around lipid-lowering therapies and the ability to prevent heart attacks, secondary prevention, effective markers to look at the stage of heart failure and progression. And so I feel like we're kind of in, in the maybe the first or second inning as it relates to that. We actually have some very good effective markers now with PET scanning, imaging, and CSF measurements, but we also recognize that those are quite expensive and they're invasive and at times. And so those two issues actually have a profound impact on patient access. Patients are either not overly excited to undergo those kinds of tests. Monetary financial barriers can exist that delay access. And so the ability to have a blood test, in our view, is a transformative effort. And obviously a number of groups, including ours, are working on that. So the, I think where the field is headed, we see a vision whereby we can use effective markers to not only identify people at the earliest stages, but then be able to track their responses to therapy using measures that are a lot more guided and precise than the clinical cognition approaches. And we think that that will really open up the ability to intervene at the earliest stages. And that's where we believe the greatest impact on clinical outcomes for patients will come. We're very interested, and we know it's highly important to be able to treat the symptoms of disease, but the ability to think about prevention and the ability to identify a person who's at elevated risk, but yet hasn't progressed to the clinical stage of Alzheimer's. If you know that condition exists using pathological biomarkers that can now be measured in blood, you can now intervene in many different creative ways, lifestyle behaviors, therapies, et cetera, et cetera.
That's very interesting, Joel. And if you can disclose to the participants and the audience, when do you think we see a test submitted for FDA approval by C2N?
That's a loaded question, Arnaud. I'll do my best to answer that. So C2N has a blood test that we call Percivity AD. And that is a test, it's a blood test that measures a panel, it's a multi-analyte panel that measures amyloid beta 42 and 40 in the blood, and apolipoprotein E proteotype, which we know is a genetic risk factor for the disease, and age, knowing that that's a risk factor. And we can combine that into a score that gives us an understanding of the likelihood of an individual having early Alzheimer's pathology. That test received a breakthrough device designation from the FDA in 2018. So we've been working closely with the FDA and trying to map out a process for a blood-based biomarker that meets the expectations for approval. This hasn't been done before, so some of this is, mapping new territory. The good news is that as we've been moving that process along, we also have a CLIA certified laboratory that can offer clinical testing services, and that's actually how we intend to roll out the first version of that test. So we expect the Percivity AD blood test. We have not made the public announcement. All I would say is that stay tuned. We're hoping to be able to release some very exciting news within the next few weeks, actually. So it's coming to the clinic, and we're very excited.
Yeah. You said it. You said too much, Joel. You said a few weeks.
You know, I tend to talk too much, so.
Thank you very much. That's really encouraging. And PONNI, Acadia, can you tell us about what you're doing? Is this a very different approach? Are you focusing on different targets, or tell us a little bit about your own development journey, in a way, to the extent you can disclose, obviously.
Sure. As HUSSEINI mentioned, I think we have to look at Alzheimer's disease through different lenses and different targets, right? And so Acadia is focused on both in its early pipeline as well as its late stage pipeline on bringing about different approaches to addressing CNS disorders. So let me talk first about the late stage part of the pipeline. That focus is really on dementia. So, and it's about not only focusing on cognition, but other symptoms, specifically, as I mentioned earlier, the neuropsychiatric symptoms. And why is this important? Because often, because there is a certain hopelessness of urgency to diagnose and treat, right? And so it's really important that this particular symptoms get recognized, because often if they're not, they progress and often lead to increased risk of repeated hospitalizations, increased risk of nursing home placement, and actually progression of the underlying dementia and even increased risk of mortality. So these symptoms include behaviors and psychological symptoms such as hallucinations, delusions, depression, and among others. Now, this is often very hard for patients and families to talk about, not just in Alzheimer's in general, because these type of symptoms are often stigmatized, right? They're portrayed in a bad way in our media, in our movies. And so actually Acadia did a patient survey in partnership with Us Against Alzheimer's Disease and Lewy Body Dementia Association with about 200 patients and caregivers. And what it showed was that majority of older adults with dementia when they experience these symptoms, are overwhelmed and don't even understand what's happening to them. And often they have a real difficulty communicating it. And so one of the really important areas we need to focus on is, in addition to bringing about diagnostics and treatments, is education and awareness. And that's a very important part of what Acadia is trying to do in this area of neuropsychiatric symptoms. Now, as I mentioned, our focus on the late pipeline is we do have a supplemental NDA that has been submitted, that is under review by the FDA right now. And it's for the support of use of pimavanserin, which is currently in the market as Nuplazid for the treatment of Parkinson's disease psychosis. But we submitted a supplemental NDA for the use of pimavanserin for the treatment of hallucinations and delusions associated with dementia-related psychosis. And this is important because, again, the pimavanserin works as a serotonin modulating agent. It works through a particular receptor called the 5-HT2A, which is thought to play a role in the development of psychosis. And we are hoping to be able to, get the PDUFA date, or the FDA action date, is on April 3rd, 2021. So through this means, we're hoping to bring about the first, hopefully, FDA-approved treatment for these conditions. And this is important right now because doctors are struggling because there is no drugs approved right now, they're managing what they can and making trade-offs with the off-label use of current treatments that are available. And so I think this will be a very important step in the armamentarium the doctors have to help these patients, and which is really critical because research has shown when both patients and caregivers' burden increases, as I mentioned earlier, if there's extreme burden, 8 times more likely these patients get placed in a nursing home. And as we know, that increases societal costs and burdens for the families, caregivers, and for other strata of society.
Yeah, very remarkable comment you're making, PONNI, especially in the period we live in, where we have seen that population all the adults in senior living facilities devastated, and many of them have been Alzheimer patients. And you made also a point, HUSSEINI, before. I think you said something like it will have to be like we have learned on HIV, or like we're learning every day on cancer. It's going to be a combination of approaches enabled by diagnosis. And Shirfi, obviously, I mean, at Biogen, there are things you need to be guarded about for reasons of protection of shareholders, and also because you have your own dialogue with the FDA. So tell us as much as you can tell. I don't know what you can tell and disclose. It must be very tough for you, but please go on.
Yeah. No, thank you. I really welcome this opportunity once again, and I share the enthusiasm really of my colleagues here about the promise of change, of treatments to come in the near future. So before we talk about aducanumab, which I'm sure everybody wants to talk about, I just want to remind your audience that Biogen actually has 5 programs in the clinic, right? So this is very significant. This is our biggest R&D effort ever. 2 of those are done in partnership with our partner Eisai, right? Also very much focused on neuroscience, just like Biogen. And so for aducanumab, now I just wanted to, I was just reflecting on this exactly a year ago at this very summit of Us Against Alzheimer's in Washington, D.C. I stood before the audience and made the announcement that Biogen was going to submit the BLA for the approval of aducanumab, potentially the first disease-modifying treatment. So this was a major celebration. I remember the audience on the Hill in DC, and George in particular, and other colleagues, very, very enthusiastic and ecstatic. And so I'm really happy to give you a brief update here today, to the extent that I can, obviously, without compromising the process. Now, this is it's been a long journey since October last year. As you all know, you've followed the news. A lot of speculation in the news. That's also to be expected, given the importance of this application that we have. The bottom line here is, in July, we submitted the BLA, right, with the FDA. And in parallel, we started also discussing and engaging other regulators in other countries, because this is obviously a worldwide problem. The FDA approved our submission with fast track designation in August, and a PDUFA date of March the 7th. So this is more or less 5 months from now. So 5 months from now, hopefully, fingers crossed, we could have the first disease-modifying treatment in the United States, and hopefully soon after that in the rest of the world, at least in the countries where we're very much engaged with the regulators. Now, this is it's been a major undertaking, as you can imagine. Our scientists and colleagues, both on the Biogen side as well as Eisai side, the collaborators have been working almost around the clock to get this to get the submission done. And so we're very, very pleased with where we are today. Stay tuned. November the 6th, there will be advisory committee. So this is also an important milestone, and we're getting ready for that. And then, more to come. So I mean, I look forward to discussing the considerations and things that we need to be doing together. And once again, I really share the enthusiasm of my colleagues. At the end of the day, it's going to be a collaborative effort. We're going to need biomarkers and hopefully blood very soon, as Joel has promised. Right, Joel?
No pressure. Thank you.
Exactly. So this is going to be one of the big barriers that we're going to need to address.
Yeah, this is precisely where I wanted to go, because and by the way, thank you for being so involved in the Davos Alzheimer collaborative partnership that we will be launching early next year. Where I wanted to go is I'm thinking about DAC, and DAC as a work stream on health systems readiness and preparedness. And how do you see this happening in the context of the new drug? Shirfi, if again you can disclose, because that will, your treatment will apply, as far as I can read, to a subset of a certain population, which will need characterization of that subset and the reimbursement for that characterization, call it diagnostics or quantification. Is this a discussion that is progressing?
Yeah, I'm happy to, sorry.
Over to you.
Yeah, I'm happy to share how we're thinking about this, right? How we are preparing to manage complexity and to prepare for the potential launch of aducanumab. I think the first thing to remember is that aducanumab is a targeted treatment. So this is a very important concept, and we're going to need to manage expectations, right? It is unlikely that aducanumab is going to be for all patients. So really, this is where the diagnostic comes in. It's really important to make sure that A-beta confirmation is available, is affordable, so that patients could be, the screened patient could be diagnosed and confirmed. So this is really one important consideration. The second important consideration is specialist care. The RAND report has actually run studies in multiple countries, including the US, Canada, Europe, Australia, and so forth. What they all have in common really is the fact that there aren't enough neurologists, there aren't enough specialists who are going to care for these patients. And the primary care physicians are not going to be equipped to deal with these medications, at least not initially. It will take a long time before they get there. So I think education is going to be important, managing expectations is going to be important, and making those diagnostic tools available and affordable is key. So once we work on that, obviously we have to also motivate the public payers and the policymakers to actually fund the treatment in all its totality, right? So it's the drug cost, it's the infusion, it's the diagnostics, and so forth. So we are engaging appropriately with the payers as we speak. We have a number of interactions with experts to help us understand those barriers and come up with strategies to make sure that from day one, as much as possible, we have tools in place that will allow the right patients to be screened, to be diagnosed, and to be linked to care. Just to give an idea, in the United States, just to ground everyone on the numbers a little bit, obviously you read about very, very high numbers, 10 million, 15 million patients who might be MCI or early AD, mild AD dementia. But once you start drilling down and you start understanding the numbers, right, you use the funnel of how many are actually connected to care, how many are actually clinically diagnosed, and how many you expect to have A-beta positivity, and so forth. That number comes down to somewhere around 1.5 million.
Yeah.
Roughly 1.5 million patients in the United States who would be candidates for aducanumab treatment, just to ground everyone. Now, obviously not all of them will have immediate access, and that's something to work on.
No, I think that's we need to think about patients and family, and I think it's super important that the world, or we communicate precisely on those hopes and also don't create expectations that can't be met. So listen, after this first round, I can tell you we have a lot of interest in the audience, and with no particular responder asked, but every one of you, in a way, I'd like to reflect on some of the questions that have been raised by attendees, and one of them was because Husseini, you touched on digital markers. And there is an interest to understand what it is.
Sure.
Is this the way we walk, we talk, we sleep, we interact with a computer? Is this an iPhone? What is that? Or is this everything. So if every one of you, when you have an interest, please, I understand Husseini, you want to.
Sure, maybe I could start, and maybe I could start, and I'm sure my colleagues will add. So I do think that one of the things that to be also excited about is the digital technology revolution, and the hope is that we can, utilize it to improve outcomes for our patients. And I think coming back to the question from the audience, I think it's in a couple of parameters. One would be the specific cognitive measures. So for the longest time in Alzheimer's disease, we've basically had almost kind of paper and pencil questions of people about asking them about, something like episodic verbal memory, some of those things that we think, change early. And what we're finding is that you can ask some similar questions using digital means that actually recapitulate, with a lot of accuracy, kind of what someone in the clinic would be doing. So for example, we've even developed an iPad-based test to try and develop very early on, that might be something we come back to, why it's so important to pick up the disease early on, but very early on, some of the earliest changes in cognition that you could pick up with digital means. So I think that's one of the things. But I think potentially to be even more excited is the way you frame the question, is that we know that, for example, things like speech, there is, you can pick up through speech changes in brain function that could be indicative of something like dementia, also depression and other things. Things like your keystrokes, so how fast you're typing, could do that. Same thing with things like movement. So the thought is that with using some of these digital technologies, you can use them both to pick up early warning signals, because I think as we've heard from, many of our illustrious panelists, we have, insufficient number of specialists, etc. So how are you even going to decide who to send for a specialist exam, etc.? But if you can have some of these early warning signals that could even be coming through passively from people's smartphones, or in some cases you ask them to do certain tests, then you could use that as a screen to decide, okay, who needs to go for the slightly more confirmatory test. But I think even in terms of the readouts right now, and again, this is one of the things that COVID-19 is even showing us, all of us with our clinical trials almost made our patients come to the clinic for every visit, etc. If you can make some of these things more virtual and have the fidelity and the confidence that they're also accurate, and the FDA is completely along these lines, I think it'll also improve clinical trials. It'll maybe give you even more objective measures. It'll have less caregiver burden. And my strong, the last thing I'll mention on this point is my strong, suggestion here would be that this is not to take the place of people. I do think that, the one-to-one interaction, working with your, healthcare provider, that's very important, but this is to aid them. So if you can do some of the work of the digital means, then when you're meeting with your healthcare provider, you can actually focus on your life and things that matter, not how much did you sleep, how much did you do this, etc. So I'm actually optimistic about that.
That's very interesting, because also it enlightens the scope of work that needs to be delivered by the Davos Alzheimer Collaborative when it comes to longitudinal studies and cohort, and the type of non-traditional biomarkers that need to be captured. So that's interesting. PONNI, over to you.
Yeah, so I wanted just to add on that. So Acadia is also very interested in this area. In fact, right now we have some phase 4 trials that's ongoing in Parkinson's disease psychosis, where we're using as exploratory endpoints exactly what Husseini was talking about, which includes more digital tools. For example, using an iPad and giving a situation and seeing how for example, how do you make take a recipe and cook something? And so using kind of real world situations rather than, the traditional neuropsychological test, to see how this would translate into outcomes in the clinical trial. In addition, I want to make an important point about telemedicine. I think we've seen in the pandemic, right, that telemedicine has played a huge role in allowing patients and caregivers and their doctors to interact. But this has been particularly important in mental health disorders and CNS disorders. And so that's an important tool I think we need to continue to support from a reimbursement perspective, from a technology perspective, because I think this is going to allow us to reach more patients, especially like in remote areas, or those care patients who are too frail to be able to come to the clinic. How do we use these tools so that we can reach more patients so they get the care and the treatments that they deserve?
Very, very, very interesting. Very interesting. Joel, are you seeing that that correlation between behavioral metrics and the type of diagnostics you're working on that is based on more traditional biomarkers?
So we definitely see some correlations, and this is actually an area that we haven't done enough research on, but it's one that we're actively under collaboration with a number of industry groups and also academic collaborators who are asking some really important questions. And I think the power of having multiple modalities available to help identify, track, stage disease, and then ultimately monitor the effectiveness of therapies. The robustness of multiple diagnostics allows for one to, again, make new correlations, which will also lead to new discoveries and advances in the field. I think historically our company has heavily focused on pathological markers, as you know, everyone might be aware that the diagnosis of Alzheimer's is really a pathological one, and it's not overly useful to have a diagnosis based on autopsy, but rather thinking about how can we identify individuals while they're, you know, presenting with the earliest stages. And I think that you know, turning the condition from a clinical diagnosis into one that is a clinical pathological diagnosis will really advance the field. And I think that's where you'll find the marriage between a lot of these digital markers and some of the biological markers that we focus on. And we're interested in a whole variety of markers. I think some of these have been touched upon earlier in the video, where we think about amyloid, and we think about tau, and we also think about markers of progressive neuronal injury, which might be certain tau species. It might be certain fragments of neurofilament light chain, alpha-synuclein, TDP43. I mean, there's a whole host of proteins that are now implicated in the various presentations of Alzheimer's disease, as we're now understanding the pathological basis of that disease. So this is an area of great excitement to us, and where we'll continue to, you know, obtain data and hopefully be able to share that in the years ahead.
Arnaud, could I just amplify something? Thanks. So I do think, Joel, you know, like all the panels have made a very good point. Until relatively recently, Alzheimer's disease, you know, as he pointed out, you know, by and large a clinical diagnosis, except for, you know, sort of measurement of pathology at autopsy, etc. And if we can, you know, recognize that Alzheimer's disease is not Alzheimer's dementia. The dementia is almost an end stage of a disease process that's been cooking for many years. So you can understand that if you know, going to wait until people have cognitive changes, the disease has been cooking for many years. So if you can pick up some of these early biologic changes, you can hopefully see, okay, who's at the start of the disease? You know, I think just coming back to the cardiovascular example, you know, might be thinking about picking up cholesterol early so you prevent the heart attack or the stroke. And that's the kind of mindset we need. And I think, you know, I think there's reasons to be optimistic. You know, people are working on medications or even vaccines targeting amyloid or tau. But I think there's more and more data suggesting that we all, you know, almost every disease is a combination of genes and environmental factors, and that's true of dementia as well. And now we've learned a lot about the modifiable risk factors, and a lot of them are actually related to cardiovascular health, diabetes, depression, etc. So the more we can sort of educate people to really even look after these things, I think the more we can sort of try and prevent the end state. So I think that's a very important thing we need to work on to educate people about.
Yeah, and you know, Shirfi, I'm going to ask you about, by the way, because yeah, we've seen indicators of probability of the disease to develop like 20 years before dementia would happen, right? But what can we do? I mean, changing nutrition, changing what type of behaviors are you going to change that is going to have an effect at this early stage? Over to you, Shirfi.
Yeah, so a couple of comments. First of all, I think that you know, there's hope that the digital. I want to just comment on that part before getting to your question. On the digital biomarker, early indicator as a tool for screening, I think there's reason to be hopeful. At Biogen, we actually did a pilot in MS, multiple sclerosis.
Mm-hmm.
We developed a tool that allows us to do just that: passive monitoring of patients. You know, looking at their dexterity, their strength, their vision, as they go about using their iPhone on a daily basis. And that information is then communicated to the healthcare provider. You know, an algorithm is used to then inform and predict who might get, you know, into a worsening state in their MS and so forth. So the tools are there, and we are working very, very hard to develop solutions also for Alzheimer's patients. So more to come on that. If you're interested, at the last Congress in MS called ECTRIMS, just in September last month, we presented some preliminary data on this tool in MS called Explorer. Connectum. Sorry, Connectum is the one that I was referring to. So back to your question. Obviously, amyloid builds over time, and I think the way we're thinking about this is that through education, through training, lifestyle changes, as HUSSEINI was alluding to, you can control. You know, you can control for some of the risk factors, maybe 40%. You know, literature says that you could probably control up to 40% using a variety of those lifestyle changes. But ultimately, you're going to need intervention. And the key then is to try to screen and predict who is likely to progress. And this is where the digital biomarkers come in. This is where the simple blood biomarker would come in. And a drug like aducanumab, if approved, would be ideal for a patient who is in the MCI stage. Because once you're in that stage, then you could delay disease progression and hopefully maintain patients in that stage for as long as possible, so they can remain independent. They could go about their, you know, activities of daily living and so forth. And that really is the ideal place. These DMTs that we're talking about.
Yeah, and PONNI, is this also your view, because you were talking about education before, is this also your view that lifestyle changes could have an effect on the course of the disease to the magnitude of 40% maybe, or maybe more? What do you think?
So there's definitely evidence, right, that following a healthy lifestyle does affect your body, not just your heart and other organs, but also your brain. And there's, I think, professors such as Gary Small at UCLA have been articulating this because, you know, just like Joel mentioned, you know, for a heart attack, you want to treat the heart attack, but you want to go way up front. How do you prevent it? And so similarly, it's much easier to start when the brain is healthy rather than when it's been damaged and then trying to reverse, right? So it is a very important component. But I think there's three areas that has particularly gotten some attention. I think one is managing as far as your getting exercise, physical and mental exercise. It has been clearly shown that even as you age, taking up a new language, doing puzzles, doing things that that does challenge your brain is really important. Second is healthy nutritional diet, which is important not just for your heart, but for your brain, right? Things that we all know, complex carbohydrates, decreasing sugar that causes inflammation. And I think the third is stress management. Stress definitely plays a role. And so what are the other, you know, there's a big emphasis right now about wellness, right? How do you use techniques such as yoga, meditation? All those factors are important and can play a role. So I think sometimes right now, as I mentioned earlier, dementia can create a sense of hopelessness. But I also think there are things we can do early on that we have control over. But at the same time, investments in these treatments and diagnostics is critically important as well. So it really is a multifactorial approach.
That's that's very interesting. And actually, that's a question from the audience that you kindly addressed is really why is this so important to make those early intervention happen, but then when do you start? 20 years old, 30 years old? What age should you start using those early detection tools?
No, I have an opinion on that.
Sure.
Like many things, but I think it's an excellent question. I think all of the comments by the rest of the panelists have been spot on. I think Ponni, you really eloquently summarized, the value of kind of understanding what's happening early and thinking about lifestyle interventions. There is ample data now. I mean, overwhelming data to support that you can actually have an impact on this disease by using things that we know are generally good for the body. What is good for the heart is generally good for the brain. I mean, the tissues are not so markedly different. They have very similar origins, right? And so when we think about issues that impact tissue health, inflammation, dietary consumption, how actively we exercise, how often we stimulate, and challenge our thinking, that these can have an impact on affecting, cognition and ultimately Alzheimer's disease. Just one other point. I think, in my experience and having spent a lot of time in health services research and thinking about the importance of patient consumerism and the informed patient, in virtually every single clinical condition that is known, the more informed a patient is and the more proactive a patient is on their health and their caregivers and their physician, the better the decisions made. And so, we think this educational component is really a very important point that really probably, warrants even more attention, because it is generally supported education by the phenomenal work of the nonprofit organizations and foundations. But there's almost needs to be that industry support for education, because if industry will be providing the innovative solutions to treatment and even diagnosis, we need to ensure that individuals understand that, as Ponni indicated, that Alzheimer's, while it can instill kind of a sense of hopelessness, that you can be proactive and you can take measures that will improve your quality of life and even, forestall the progression of the disease. And so I think that these are really challenges that all of us need to come together to support and think about ways to kind of influence and create a perception, understanding of the disease that really hasn't existed before, because historically people have said, well, it's, disease of aging and it's a slow, continuous progression. Turn it into something that's a little more proactive. The acuteness of a heart attack stimulates a lot of people to make changes. Let's think about brain injury the same way. And that's really the core focus at C2N, which is developing really a comprehensive brain health panel to help measure brain health and allow patients to be more informed in how they're doing and how they're hopefully improving with lifestyle changes and ultimately therapies.
Thank you, Joel, and I think this topic alone would deserve a panel of its own, and I would love to stay on that topic, because I think it's also where it gets so close to patients and families. But we have also quite a number of questions I need to say on the type of clinical trial. And the first one is, do you see a risk with what's happening with COVID at this point in time, that we've researched since vaccines and therapeutics and diagnostics? I think considerable amounts of money will be diverted from neuroscience and clinical research?
Maybe I can start, Arnaud. So I think it's both a risk and an opportunity. I think there's no question, we're all living in this world, and we've seen the tremendous, not only pain and suffering, but costs from COVID-19. And it's understandable that, a lot of resources are going towards COVID-19. And so what many of us are trying to do is work with our, legislators and others to make sure that, of course, COVID-19 is very, very important, but there are other pandemics, and dementia is one of them, that are also important. And we've just got to make sure we don't, stop research or reduce research efforts there. And I think, as you correctly pointed out, with COVID-19, unfortunately, a lot of people passing away have been elderly people with dementia in nursing homes, so it's even further shining the spotlight. I do think when I said sort of reason to be optimistic, indirectly, I even alluded to the fact that, more things are, the FDA is even agreeing to, more things done virtually. And I think a lot of credit to the UK folks who did and are still doing the recovery trial, where, they would basically design this trial and had 175 participating sites with 10,000 patients in a record time. And I think it's also sort of pointing out to us that at times we are the victims of our own bureaucratic processes. We always assume this is always the way it has to be. But if we can, even learn from some of the things that have come from COVID-19 to incorporate into our trials, which would include, taking advantage of digital technology, using data-enabled recruitment, coming back to what Joel mentioned, real engagement with patients and members of the public. Obviously in dementia, caregivers are very important. So I think we all have to, if you will, lobby to make sure that funds are not, taken away from neuroscience during this crisis we're in. But maybe we can also take advantage of some of the learnings, especially about streamlining clinical trials and doing things in a new way that might help our patients as well. So I think if we're sensible, we can actually allow this situation not to stop research, but do research in new, more efficient ways.
And more efficient ways, and more diverse also. I'm thinking about the minorities and the inclusions of minorities. What do you think? What can be done? Over to all of you, maybe starting with you, PONNI.
Yeah, so just commenting on the COVID, I agree with HUSSEINI. This is an opportunity to learn. And actually, COVID also affects the brain, right? This has been described as brain fog. And it is also patients who have recovered from COVID continue to have these long-term symptoms. So I do think it is also a CNS disease. But to HUSSEINI's point, I think there's great opportunities, and we have done that within Acadia, is because it has affected our clinical trials process, it has made us think innovatively, how do we continue to see patients in clinical trial settings? How do we use remote technology? So I do think just the fact that we're here having a panel discussion remotely speaks to that fact, right? We would not have considered this a year ago. So I think this is a very important opportunity for that. Second, with regards to minorities, I think that is really, really important. Majority of our trials are in Caucasians. However, mental illness and brain diseases such as Alzheimer's affects a lot of different races and ethnicities. And so, but I think we have to be very sensitive to what are the incentivization for people of different communities to participate in these trials. There have been, right, episodes where it has caused distrust, which means we have to work with the leaders in those communities and hear what they are saying and be transparent about how we're going to address those concerns and be really committed to it, not just do it as a, as a statement, but follow it up with action. Which, and HUSSEINI mentioned that too, and I think Joel mentioned it, is the patient voice and the caregiver voice is going to be very, very critical. And I think FDA has really supported that. So it's not just later when the drug is on the market, it's when we are developing our trials, FDA wants to hear the voices. And that's one of the reasons we actually did the patient caregiver survey that I mentioned. It's actually part of our filing. And so as we think about, involving minorities, we have to go and get their perceptions and what they are feeling, and then working with them to improve the enrollment of all different groups in our clinical trials, including in our Alzheimer's trials.
Yeah, and I'd like, because this is so important, if anyone wants to chime in on the same topic, please, Shafi.
Yeah, so, I agree that COVID is a challenge, but also an opportunity. Obviously, the governments are going to be challenged in the US as well as outside of the US. So as companies that have developed treatments, Biogen or my colleagues here on the panel, we're going to need to be very responsible in the way we bring these drugs to market. We're going to need to engage with the public payers to try and find ways that will make sure that budgets are going to be able to accommodate the treatment of large numbers of patients, appropriate patients and so forth. So we are very well aware of that, and we're working on different models and different approaches to be innovative in the way we would potentially come to market with aducanumab in this case. I also agree with my colleagues that the regulators, FDA and others, have been very willing to work with us on finding ways to do remote monitoring of patients in clinical trials. They have worked with us to find ways to upgrade labels so that we could do home administration in cases where patients are afraid to go to the hospital. So we have infused drugs in our portfolio at Biogen where we can actually now send teams to the home of the patient and infuse them in a safe manner. And so that's going to be a consideration potentially for aducanumab if approved in a COVID environment. And so I think COVID is an opportunity because it forces us to be innovative, and it also forces us to engage differently. So just to give you an example, our teams, whether they're MSLs or specialists who visit doctors, I mean, right now 90% of their engagement is done virtually, 90%. So that's a whole different model of engagement, which we are monitoring, and certainly I don't think we will go back to the world before COVID going forward. So
thank you very much. And listen, we are 3 minutes before this fascinating conversation is going to end. I'm personally very I find myself more optimistic at the end of that conversation than I was before, and I was starting optimistic, by the way. And that's also because it's so inspiring to realize that there are ways to identify the onset of the disease faster and actually address with lifestyle changes the decline, and also we see drugs coming to market, and hopefully diagnostics in a few weeks. Right, Joe? So that's remarkably inspiring. I would like to ask you a final question to all of you in no more than 40 seconds each. Gavi was launched 20 years ago, and we know the success and we know the good it has done to humanity. Tell us what you would like the Davos Alzheimer collaborative to have delivered, not 20 years ago, but not 20 years from now, but 5 years from now. Think about what needs to accelerate in the field of research, and what's the one most important point where a collaboration, public-private, of that nature can make a difference. I'm
happy to. I mean, no, I think it's very inspiring, Arnaud. If we can just get, the World Economic Forum to be a catalyst for serious commitment to declare Alzheimer's as a public health emergency, I think that would be very, very, very valuable. I mean, this happened in HIV. Remember, in the early days of HIV, it was declared. Many countries declared HIV as a major public health emergency, which mobilized resources locally as well as globally. Right? This is where the Global Fund came from, and so I would envision a world in which countries would do just that.
Thank you. PONNI, I hope we all have a chance to say 40 seconds. Please tell us.
Sure. I think the one thing I would request is that there is a focus on across different sectors so that everybody is well informed about the advances that are being made, and then regulations evolve and access evolves. Because there's no point in bringing about new treatments, disease modifying treatments or diagnostics if the regulations don't evolve with that. And I think this is where leadership at the World Economic Forum can play a significant role globally.
And that's where we want to work with the CEO initiative on Alzheimer and Nurse Against Alzheimer. They are privileged partners, and HUSSEINI, and the final word to you, Joel.
Okay, thank you, Arnaud. So I think you really, one of the things I'd emphasize, and I think the World Economic Forum has the gravitas to do this, is exactly what we've discussed, to really make sure this is global. Because as you know, the majority of people touched by this illness are actually in low and middle income countries. And what we've got to avoid trying to do is, just have a Western focus and then deploy it to low and middle income countries. Let's have people throughout the world participating in the research, letting us know what's needed, and develop treatments with them in mind, rather than, just starting with the West. So I think that's something that the World Economic Forum can play a big role in.
Thank you very much, and we'll do that with our partners. Again, with so phenomenal to work with George and team. And the final word to you, Joel.
Thank you, Arnaud. So I would be thrilled to see heightened attention to some of the ethical issues. Some of these points have already been discussed: accessibility and affordability. There are still enormous disparities in healthcare. And I think that as we start introducing cutting edge technologies, both in therapies and diagnostics and other approaches to intervening, that we have to be really sensitive to that and think about ways to help finance what's an expensive proposition. I also think around the ethics of understanding now that individuals will have an ability to actually track disease like they've never been able to track, both physicians and patients, to understand the education involved of what it means to have an early quote unquote pathological diagnosis, and what can be done to intervene, and the ethics around disclosure. So how is an executive to respond based on an early pathological observation? What does that mean in professional and personal lifestyle? And I think that the whole system needs to be prepared to have these discussions as we start getting these targeted therapies and effective diagnostics on the market.
Well, with that, Joel, and with that, all of you, I need to thank you so much for being so inspiring today. I hope attendees have learned as much as I did, and they were also equally inspired. Thank you very, very much, and I wish you a good rest of the day.
Thank you.